The Reverend Blackwood's wife, it transpired, was a woman of the sort one encounters with reasonable frequency in English parishes, that peculiar amalgamation of domestic competence and social acuity that marks the wives of clergymen as distinct from ordinary womankind. Mrs. Constance Blackwood received them in the vicarage's morning room with a composure that suggested murder in the churchyard was merely a slightly elevated variation on the Tuesday routine. She was perhaps 55, possessed of greying hair arranged with geometric precision, and wore the expression of someone who had long ago catalogued the universe's capacity for disappointment and found it unsurprising. "Augustus Tremaine," she said, when informed of the discovery, in a tone that managed to convey both sympathy and a certain philosophical resignation to the matter. How perfectly dreadful. Though I cannot claim to be entirely shocked. The man was courting his own doom with the steadiness of a lover approaching an assignation. Whimsy, who had settled himself into a wing-back chair with the air of a man prepared to remain there until the secrets of the universe were adequately disclosed, smiled with genuine appreciation. Courting his doom, you say? A rather poetic formulation. Pray, elucidate. I find myself possessed of a sudden and overwhelming curiosity regarding Mr. Tremaine's doom-courting activities. Mrs. Blackwood regarded him with a sort of assessing gaze that suggested she was determining whether he was worth the expenditure of her observations. Apparently, she concluded affirmatively, for she settled herself upon the sofa with deliberate grace. Augustus Tremaine was a man of considerable wealth and negligible character, she began, which is not an uncommon combination, but in his case, the negligibility was rather pronounced. He had made his fortune in manufacturing. Something to do with textiles, I believe, though the particulars were never quite clear, possibly because Augustus himself was never quite clear on the matter. What was abundantly clear, however, was his determination to purchase respectability through the simple expedient of donating money to every institution within a 5-mile radius that possessed a roof and a charitable mission. A philanthropist, then, suggested Whimsy. How entirely admirable. Though I note your tone suggests a conviction that his motives were somewhat less elevated than surface appearances might indicate. Motives, said Mrs. Blackwood with the air of one employing a word she found slightly distasteful, are rarely what they appear. Augustus Tremaine had recently taken considerable interest in the village, though I recall perfectly well that he found us beneath his notice entirely until approximately 6 months ago. He arrived at St. Crispin's with a donation that made the vicar's hands shake, purchased Tremaine House, that monstrous Victorian pile on Ashford Lane, you understand, and set about making himself indispensable to every person of consequence within the parish. How fascinating, murmured Whimsy. And this sudden devotion to local philanthropy coincided with his relocation to the area? Precisely. It struck me as rather convenient, if I may be frank. Augustus Tremaine was running from something, or towards something, but running nonetheless. The question, naturally, was what? Whimsy leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture that suggested profound concentration. "And have you formed any hypothesis regarding the nature of this mysterious motivation?" Mrs. Blackwood hesitated, a pause so brief as to be nearly imperceptible, yet sufficiently extended to indicate that what followed had been carefully considered before being. Released into the world. There is a young woman employed at the village school as a music mistress. Her name is Miss Eleanor Hartwell. She arrived approximately 5 months ago, which was 1 month subsequent to Augustus Tremaine's own arrival. She is, by all accounts, a woman of considerable accomplishment and rather unremarkable beauty. The sort of young woman one might encounter in any respectable household, neither striking nor forgettable. What is striking, however, is the manner in which Augustus Tremaine contrived to become her patron. Her patron, repeated Whimsy thoughtfully. How charmingly Victorian of him, and how did this patronage manifest itself? He endowed a position specifically for her at the school, then proceeded to attend every musical performance she organized. He presented her with gifts, nothing scandalous, mind you, but sufficient to suggest that his interest transcended the purely philanthropic. More significantly, he began to frequent the school at hours when his presence served no explicable purpose other than to observe Miss Hartwell conducting her lessons or taking her afternoon constitutionals through the village. The vicar's wife paused, allowing this information to settle into the atmosphere like sediment in still water. "I suspect," she continued, "that Miss Hartwell may have been rather more than merely a recipient of patronage. I suspect, though I possess no proof, that she was the reason Augustus Tremaine came to this village at all." Whimsy rose from his chair with a fluidity that seemed to violate several principles of ordinary physics, and moved to the window, where he gazed out upon the rain-swept village with an expression of contemplative interest. "And where does Miss Hartwell currently reside?" he inquired. "Does she maintain lodgings of her own, or does she board with some respectable family determined to ensure that our respectability remains mutual?" "The latter," confirmed Mrs. Blackwood. "She lodges with the Mrs. Hartwell, no relation, despite the shared surname, two elderly sisters of limited means but considerable discretion, in a cottage at the end of Parish Lane." "Parish Lane," said Whimsy, turning from the window with an expression of mild amusement. "How entirely appropriate. The lane itself sounds as though it ought to have historical significance, or at the very least a rather interesting etymology. But I digress. This Miss Eleanor Hartwell, does she possess any particular vulnerabilities, any secrets, indiscretions, or unfortunate connections that might render her either a victim of blackmail or a perpetrator of violence?" Mrs. Blackwood's expression grew considerably more guarded. "She is, so far as anyone knows, a woman of irreproachable character. Though character, as I believe I have already suggested, is often largely a matter of insufficient information rather than genuine virtue." Whimsy smiled, and it was a smile that suggested the game was moving into considerably more interesting terrain. "Precisely," he said. "How very refreshing to encounter someone who understands the distinction. I believe, Mrs. Blackwood, that I shall very much enjoy investigating this matter. The cottage at the end of Parish Lane proved to be precisely the sort of dwelling one expected to house two elderly sisters of limited means but considerable discretion, which is to say, it was charming in that particular fashion that implies genteel poverty, all whitewashed walls and climbing roses attempting to obscure the rather alarming tilt of the roof." Whimsy arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, accompanied by the vicar, who had proven surprisingly useful as both a source of information and a shield against the more gossipy elements of the parish. The Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Catherine and Miss Eleanor, elderly siblings who had outlived husbands, children, and most forms of conventional optimism, received them in a parlor that smelled of lavender and old books, with tea that was considerably superior to what one would have anticipated given the modest circumstances. "Miss Eleanor Hartwell?" Whimsy inquired of the younger of the two lodgers, a woman perhaps 28 years of age, with a sort of face that improved considerably when one examined it directly rather than in passing. She possessed dark hair arranged with artistic simplicity, intelligent grey eyes that suggested an interior life of some complexity, and the peculiar posture of someone accustomed to sitting still for extended periods whilst producing beautiful sounds from inanimate objects. "I am she," replied Miss Hartwell, with composure that suggested she had been expecting this interview or something very much like it. "Though I confess I am uncertain what brings Lord Peter Whimsy to interview me regarding what I understand to be a matter of considerable local distress. Word travels with remarkable alacrity in villages," observed Whimsy, accepting a cup of tea from Miss Catherine with gracious appreciation. "I find it always does. People are far more efficient at disseminating information than any telegram service could manage. Mr. Augustus Tremaine has been discovered deceased under circumstances that suggest he did not shuffle off this mortal coil through any natural process of aging or misadventure." Miss Eleanor's composure remained intact, but Whimsy noted with the particular attention he devoted to such minutiae that her hand stilled considerably, and her teacup was set down with rather more deliberation than the ordinary laws of gravity would require. "I see," she said quietly. "That is very dreadful. Mr. Tremaine was a generous man." "Generous," repeated Whimsy thoughtfully as, though examining a word that had been newly minted and might yet prove counterfeit, "an interesting selection of adjectives. Most generous men are possessed of equally interesting motivations. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, In what manner did Mr. Tremane's generosity manifest itself toward your person specifically?" There was a pause, not so much a hesitation as a deliberate pause, a drawing of breath that suggested careful consideration before proceeding. "He was interested in music," said Miss Hartwell. "He endowed my position at the school. He attended performances. It was not, I believe, an unusual arrangement. Wealthy men frequently support the arts." "Wealthy men do indeed support the arts," agreed Whimsy, "though the degree of personal attention Mr. Tremaine devoted to your welfare seems to have exceeded what one might encounter in a merely transactional arrangement. According to certain sources whose access to village gossip is regrettably comprehensive, he contrived to encounter you with remarkable frequency at hours that suggest planning rather than coincidence." Miss Eleanor's face had grown somewhat paler, though her voice remained steady. "Mr. Tremaine was lonely. He had recently come to the village, and he found in music a form of solace. I believe that is not entirely uncommon." "Lonely," mused Whimsy. "How very human of him. And did you find in Mr. Tremaine's company a form of solace as well, or was your relationship rather more significantly unbalanced?" It was Miss Catherine who intervened, her aged voice carrying a quality of surprising authority. "Lord Peter, you seem to be implying something rather unpleasant about my lodger. Eleanor is a young woman of excellent character and considerable talent. If Mr. Tremaine chose to support her work, that speaks to his discernment, nothing more." Whimsy turned to the elder Miss Hartwell with an expression of genuine contrition. "Forgive me, Miss Catherine. I have been unforgivably blunt. It is a failing of mine, one that stems from a perhaps excessive confidence that directness, however crude, is preferable to oblique suggestion. However, I find myself constrained to observe that Miss Eleanor has not yet answered my question regarding the nature of her relationship with the deceased, and I find myself further constrained to note that her reluctance to answer is rather eloquent in itself." The room had grown extraordinarily quiet. Outside, the rain continued its methodical assault upon the countryside, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour with the persistence of a timekeeper determined that the universe would not forget itself. "Mr. Tremaine," said Miss Eleanor slowly, "believed himself to be in love with me. He was not. And how did Mr. Tremaine respond to this rather fundamental disagreement regarding the nature of his own emotional state?" asked Whimsy, with the gentleness of a man addressing something fragile. "He became increasingly persistent," admitted Miss Eleanor. "He believed that my resistance stemmed from propriety or uncertainty or some form of feminine hesitation that might eventually succumb to sufficient demonstration of his affection and resources. When I attempted to establish boundaries, he became difficult." "Difficult," echoed Whimsy. "In what manner precisely?" Miss Eleanor's hands had begun to tremble, and Miss Catherine reached across to grasp her lodger's fingers with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had survived sufficient years to recognize suffering when it manifested itself. "He became threatening," said Miss Eleanor quietly. "He suggested that if I did not reciprocate his affection, he would ensure that I was removed from my position at the school. He implied that he could ruin my reputation. He began to follow. During my walks, he appeared at hours when I was alone, and he made it clear that my continued employment depended upon a willingness to accept his attentions." Whimsy set down his teacup with the care one might accord an explosive device. "And you informed no one of this behavior?" he inquired. "I could not," said Miss Eleanor. "Who would believe me? He was the benefactor of the school, a man of considerable standing and wealth. I was merely a music mistress employed through his patronage. Any accusation I levied would be dismissed as ingratitude or imaginative fancy. He knew this, of course. That was rather the point." Whimsy rose from his chair and moved to the window, where he gazed out upon the rain-soaked garden with an expression that suggested he was conducting an internal conversation of considerable complexity. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, without turning around, "where were you last evening between the hours of 7 and midnight?" "I was here," replied Miss Eleanor. "In this cottage, in my room, reading. I did not leave the house." "Can anyone corroborate this account?" asked Whimsy. "Miss Catherine was already retired, and the other Miss Hartwell sleeps quite soundly, I believe. So, to be perfectly clear, There is no witness to your presence here during the hours when Mr. Tremaine was being murdered." He turned from the window, and his expression had grown rather more opaque than it had been heretofore. "How very inconvenient for you, Miss Hartwell." The return journey to Tremaine House was conducted in near silence, with only the rhythmic percussion of rain upon the motor car's roof providing accompaniment to Whimsy's thoughts, which appeared to be conducting their own private symphony of considerable complexity. The Reverend Blackwood, who had accompanied him to Parish Lane, found himself somewhat perplexed by his companion's demeanor, which suggested neither satisfaction at having uncovered a promising suspect, nor the intellectual excitement that generally accompanied Whimsy's investigations. Instead, Whimsy possessed the air of a man who had encountered a puzzle whose pieces, whilst appearing to fit together with admirable neatness, nonetheless refused to align along the grain of logic. "You believe her guilty?" ventured the vicar, more as a question than a statement. "I believe her to possess both motive and opportunity," replied Whimsy carefully, "which are the twin pillars upon which most criminal conviction rests. Whether belief and evidence constitute identical phenomena remains, in my experience, a matter of considerable philosophical dispute. Tremaine House, when they arrived, proved to be precisely what one would have anticipated from a self-made manufacturer with more money than aesthetic sensibility. A Victorian Gothic confection of red brick and unnecessary turrets, all sharp angles and aggressive ornamentation, as though the architect had been determined to announce to the world that his patron possessed the financial resources to support any architectural indulgence, no matter how questionable. The interior was no less chaotic, a collision of periods and styles that suggested Mr. Tremaine had purchased his furnishings the way a magpie accumulates shiny objects, according to impulse rather than coherence. The household staff, when assembled in the morning room by the housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, presented themselves with the peculiar mixture of grief and curiosity that generally characterizes servants confronted with the sudden death of their employer. There was Mullins, the butler, a man of perhaps 60, with the demeanor of someone who had seen considerably more of human nature than he cared to discuss. There was young Thomas, the valet, barely 20, and possessed of the anxious energy of someone afraid that any moment he might be blamed for something entirely beyond his control. There was Mary, the housemaid, and old Hutchins, who served as groundskeeper, and finally Mrs. Pritchard herself, a woman of remarkable capability and even more remarkable observational powers. "I require," announced Whimsy, settling himself into a chair with the air of a man conducting an official inquiry rather than merely asking questions, "to establish a precise chronology of Mr. Tremaine's movements yesterday. Specifically, I wish to know at what hour he departed Tremaine House, in whose company, if any, and with what apparent purpose or destination." Mrs. Pritchard exchanged glances with Mullins, a communication conducted entirely through the raised arch of an eyebrow and a barely perceptible tilt of the head. "Mr. Tremaine left the house at 6:30 yesterday evening," said the housekeeper carefully. "He was dressed in his outdoor coat, and he carried an umbrella, though the weather was not yet truly inclement. He informed Mullins that he would be taking an evening constitutional and would return within the hour." "And did he in fact return within the hour?" asked Whimsy. "No, sir," replied Mullins, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome information with professional detachment. "He did not return at all. When it grew late, Mrs. Pritchard instructed me to lock the house, assuming that the master had decided to dine elsewhere or remain with friends. There was nothing in his demeanor to suggest that he anticipated remaining absent through the night." "Friends," repeated Whimsy thoughtfully. "Did Mr. Tremaine possess friends? Beyond his various associations with charitable institutions and his rather singular attachment to Miss Eleanor Hartwell, I find myself uncertain whether he cultivated any relationships of genuine warmth or mutual regard." Young Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "He had visitors occasionally, sir. Gentlemen mostly. They would arrive in the evenings and remain in the study for hours. Mr. Tremaine would emerge looking rather agitated, and they would depart without taking refreshment." "Gentlemen," mused Whimsy. "How vague. Did these gentlemen possess names, professions?" Any characteristics that might distinguish them from the general population of adult males? Thomas glanced toward Mrs. Pritchard, who appeared to be conducting an internal debate regarding the propriety of disclosing information that technically fell within the bounds of household confidentiality. "One of them was a solicitor from London," she said finally. "Mr. Ashford, his name was. He visited 3 times in the past month. There were others, men of business, I should think, though they conducted themselves with less civility than one might expect. They seemed almost threatening in their manner." "Threatening," said Whimsy, with the air of one encountering a word that had suddenly acquired unexpected dimensions. "How extraordinarily interesting. And Mr. Tremane's disposition following these visits was consistently agitated." "Very much so, sir," confirmed Mrs. Pritchard. "He would spend hours in his study afterward, consuming considerably more brandy than was his custom. On one occasion I heard him speaking loudly to himself, though the words were not entirely distinct." "And did Mr. Tremaine receive any correspondence of particular significance during the past month?" asked Whimsy. "Letters, documents, anything that appeared to cause him distress or provoke unusual behavior?" There was another exchange of glances. Old Hutchins, who had remained silent until this moment, cleared his throat. "There was a letter," he said quietly, his voice bearing the rasp of age and infrequent use. "Arrived 3 weeks ago, perhaps more. It came by post, unusual thing for it, sealed quite thick and official-looking. The master received it and went quite white about the mouth, said something about debts and old promises. He locked himself in the study the entire afternoon." Whimsy leaned forward with the intensity of a man who had just identified a thread whose pulling might unravel the entire tapestry. "This letter," he said carefully. "Did you chance to observe the postmark? The origin point from which it was dispatched?" "London," said Hutchins. "Definitely London. The handwriting on the envelope was very precise, very formal, like something legal, you might say." Whimsy rose from his chair and moved to the window, where he gazed out upon the sodden gardens with an expression of profound concentration. When he spoke again, his voice possessed a quality of certainty that suggested pieces had suddenly begun to align themselves with remarkable clarity. "I should like to examine Mr. Tremaine's study," he announced. "Specifically, his correspondence, his financial records, and anything else that might illuminate the curious circumstance that a man of considerable wealth was nonetheless receiving threatening visits from individuals of questionable civility and legal bearing. It appears, if I am not greatly mistaken, that Mr. Augustus Tremaine was considerably less successful at burying his past than he had believed. Tremaine's study was a room that revealed considerably more about its occupant than any verbal testimony could have accomplished, assuming one possessed the particular faculty for reading such revelations that Whimsy had cultivated over years of observing human nature in its myriad manifestations. The walls were lined with books that appeared to have been purchased primarily for the impressive appearance they presented, rather than any genuine evidence of having been read. Ear spines unmarred and their pages uncut, the bibliographic equivalent of a facade. However, it was the desk, a substantial mahogany affair positioned to command a view of the garden, that proved genuinely illuminating. The surface was remarkably cluttered, suggesting a man whose mind operated in tangential directions and whose organizational systems were more intuitive than systematic. Letters were scattered with apparent randomness, interspersed with bills of considerable magnitude and several items of peculiar interest that Whimsy examined with the methodical precision of an archaeologist cataloguing artifacts. "Mrs. Pritchard," he called out, not looking up from the documents before him, "I require the assistance of someone possessed of intimate knowledge regarding Mr. Tremaine's habits and the general functioning of this household. Specifically, I should like to understand whether this room was customarily maintained in this state of what one might euphemistically term creative disorder, or whether this particular arrangement represents something more significant, perhaps the evidence of hurried searching or deliberate destruction of documents." The housekeeper appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone accustomed to accommodating aristocratic eccentricity. "The study was always thus, sir," she replied. "Mr. Tremaine preferred that it remain undisturbed. He would not allow me to so much as dust the desk. It was as though he required the chaos, if I may be so bold as to suggest such a thing." Whimsy nodded, as though this observation confirmed something he had already hypothesized. Precisely what I suspected: chaos as methodology, a common characteristic among individuals of considerable intelligence but limited patience. However, observe this particular collection of documents. He gestured toward a pile of letters bound together with what appeared to be an old piece of string. These have been deliberately gathered and maintained together, which suggests an importance distinct from the general disorder. Furthermore, the string itself is considerably older than the paper it binds, suggesting that these letters have been preserved for an extended period, removed from their original context, and kept separate from the general mass of correspondence. Why would a man maintain such a collection unless these particular documents possessed significance that transcended ordinary business matters? He carefully extracted one of the letters from the bundle, handling it with the care one might accord a fragile historical document. The letter was dated some 22 years prior, and was addressed in a hand that trembled with evident emotion. Whimsy read it through once, then twice, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "Good God," he murmured, in a tone that suggested genuine surprise at what the document had revealed. "How very convenient. The past, it appears, has a remarkable talent for refusing to remain buried, particularly when one has constructed one's present life upon the presumption that sufficient money can purchase absolution for previous indiscretions." He turned to Mrs. Pritchard, who remained in the doorway with the expression of someone attempting to appear simultaneously respectful and intensely curious. "Tell me," he said, "did Mr. Tremaine ever mention having been married? Or alternatively, did he receive any unexpected visits from relatives or individuals claiming to possess some form of familial connection?" Mrs. Pritchard's hesitation was sufficiently prolonged to constitute an admission. "There was a woman," she said slowly, "who came to the house perhaps 6 months ago, before he moved here permanently, you understand, when he was still in London conducting his business. Young Thomas Mentio. Ned it to me in passing. She was apparently quite distressed, demanding to see the master, insisting that he owed her family certain obligations. Mullins turned her away, naturally, but she left a calling card. I believe it was disposed of, but I recall Thomas reading the name aloud before it was discarded." "And the name?" prompted Whimsy, though his tone suggested he already suspected what it might be. "Hartwell, sir," said Mrs. Pritchard quietly. "Miss Eleanor Hartwell's maiden name, or so I would have assumed, though Eleanor arrived in the village subsequent to this incident." Whimsy set down the letter with deliberate care and rose from his position at the desk. His expression had acquired that particular quality of abstraction that suggested his mind was operating at several levels of thought simultaneously, orchestrating information into patterns that remained invisible to those observing from the outside. "The mystery," he said to no one in particular, "begins to resolve itself, though not in the manner one might have anticipated. Miss Eleanor Hartwell is not, as we initially assumed, a young woman victimized by the unwanted attentions of a predatory older man. Rather, she is the daughter, or perhaps niece, of a woman whom Mr. Tremaine wronged, and she has been deliberately positioned in this village for purposes that we must now determine." He moved to the desk and began methodically examining the remaining correspondence, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency as he selected certain documents and set them aside for closer examination. "What we have here," he continued, "is the skeleton of a narrative that spans decades and encompasses at least 2 generations of considerable suffering and carefully orchestrated revenge. Mr. Tremaine received threatening letters from individuals of legal bearing because he was being pursued for debts of a nature that transcended ordinary financial obligation. He was being pursued for a crime, or what he perceived to be a crime, that had rendered him vulnerable to blackmail. He extracted another document from the desk, this one a telegram of considerable age, its paper yellowed and brittle. This is dated 22 years ago, and it reads quite simply, "She will not survive without help. You have abandoned us to poverty and disgrace. You will pay, in this life or the next." It is unsigned, though the handwriting strongly suggests that it originated from a female correspondent. Whimsy turned to face Mrs. Pritchard, with an expression of such intensity that she involuntarily stepped backward. "I require you to answer me with absolute honesty, Mrs. Pritchard. When Mr. Tremaine was in the village, when he was not in the study with these mysterious gentlemen, when he was not pursuing Miss Eleanor Hartwell with such determined persistence, where did he spend his time? What occupied his hours? What was he searching for?" The housekeeper's face had grown considerably paler. "He spent considerable time at St. Crispin's churchyard, sir. At first I thought it was piety, but after a time I came to understand that he was examining the graves, reading the inscriptions on the headstones. He appeared to be searching for something, or perhaps someone. Hutchins mentioned that on several occasions he found the master kneeling before one particular grave, the one near the laurel shrubbery. That was where he was found, wasn't it, sir?" Whimsy closed his eyes for a moment, as though the final pieces of an extraordinarily complex puzzle were settling into their designated positions with audible finality. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, it was. How perfectly inevitable that he should be murdered at the location of his greatest guilt. How perfectly characteristic of the human capacity for believing that violence can somehow redress the injuries of time and circumstance." By evening, the rain had ceased its assault upon the countryside, and the village of Ashford had assumed that peculiar quality of stillness that characterizes small communities in the aftermath of scandal. The constabulary, under the direction of Inspector Blackthorne, a man of limited imagination but considerable determination, had begun their preliminary investigation, and it was only through considerable diplomatic negotiation that Whimsy had managed to remain involved in the proceedings at all. The inspector, it transpired, possessed the characteristic suspicion of amateurs that marked many of his profession, though he was sufficiently cognizant of Whimsy's reputation to refrain from actively obstructing his participation. Whimsy had returned to his quarters at the vicarage with a volume of church records that Mrs. Pritchard had, after considerable persuasion and the application of aristocratic charm, consented to allow him to examine. The Reverend Blackwood had retired early, claiming exhaustion both physical and spiritual, leaving Whimsy to pursue his researches in the vicar's study with nothing but a considerably excellent port and the accumulating weight of historical evidence for company. The records proved illuminating in ways that transcended mere documentation. Approximately 23 years prior, there had been a burial recorded for one Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell, aged 26 years, described as beloved daughter of Thomas and Margaret Hartwell, taken into God's keeping after prolonged suffering. The description was sufficiently vague to encompass any manner of terminal malady, yet Whimsy found himself increasingly convinced that the vagueness was deliberate, a discretion extended by the then vicar to conceal circumstances that the parish would have preferred to remain on discu. Cross-referencing the parish records with the birth registry proved more challenging, but eventually Whimsy located the relevant entry. Eleanor Margaret Hartwell, born to Thomas Hartwell and an unnamed mother, approximately 1 year subsequent to Catherine's death. The precision of the dates suggested a narrative of considerable complexity. A young woman, Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell, had apparently been seduced or compromised by Augustus Tremaine, had become pregnant, had been abandoned, and had subsequently died under circumstances sufficiently tragic or disgraceful that the parish deemed discretion preferable to clarity. The child of this union, Eleanor Margaret, had been raised by Catherine's parents and presumably by a younger sister, one of the Miss Hartwells currently providing lodging to the younger Eleanor. What was emerging was not a case of simple attempted seduction, but rather one of systematic abandonment, family tragedy, and decades of accumulated resentment. Whimsy was in the process of correlating these findings when a knock at the vicar's study door interrupted his reverie. He looked up to find young Thomas, the valet from Tremaine House, standing in the doorway with an expression suggesting that he had overcome considerable internal resistance in order to make this particular visit. "Forgive me, sir," said Thomas hesitantly, "but I felt compelled to speak with you privately. There is something regarding Mr. Tremaine and the household that I believe you ought to know. Something that I did not feel comfortable discussing in front of the other staff members." Whimsy gestured toward the chair opposite his own. Please, sit. I find that information provided under such circumstances of evident reluctance generally possesses considerably more reliability than testimony offered with alacrity. Thomas settled himself into the chair with the careful move. Meant of someone uncertain whether his presence was genuinely welcome. "It concerns Miss Eleanor Hartwell," he began, his voice barely above a whisper despite the privacy of the room. "The truth is, sir, I believe I know something of her connection to the master, though I did not wish to reveal it earlier for fear of implicating her in something more serious than mere romantic complications." "You are acquainted with Miss Hartwell?" prompted Whimsy. "I am, sir," admitted Thomas. "We have become friendly through mutual interest in the village. I have called upon her at the cottage on several occasions, ostensibly to discuss matters of parish concern, though the truth is somewhat more personal in nature. She confided in me, sir, approximately 1 week ago, that she had discovered something disturbing regarding Mr. Tremaine's past." Whimsy's entire posture shifted subtly, suggesting that Thomas's statement had altered the trajectory of his investigative reasoning. "Discovered? In what manner precisely?" "She has been attending to the church archives, sir, as part of her duties assisting the vicar's wife with cataloguing historical documents. In the course of this work, she encountered the burial record for her aunt, Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell. She was devastated, sir, absolutely devastated, for she had always believed her aunt had died abroad, of consumption. She did not know the truth until she read the parish records." "And what is the truth, according to Miss Hartwell's interpretation?" asked Whimsy. "That her aunt was seduced and abandoned by Augustus Tremaine, that she became pregnant, that the pregnancy resulted in her death, and that Mr. Tremaine had never acknowledged any responsibility for the tragedy. She told me that her grandmother, the elder Miss Hartwell, still residing in the cottage, had made a deathbed confession to her shortly before Eliano R. came to the village. The confession revealed that Mr. Tremaine had been located in London, that he had been approached regarding his obligation to the family, and that he had refused entirely to acknowledge either the relationship or the resulting consequences." Whimsy set down his port glass with deliberate care. "And this revelation, coming as it did to Miss Eleanor relatively recently, occurred prior to Mr. Tremaine's murder?" "Yes, sir. Approximately 2 weeks prior. She was tremendously angry, sir, far more angry than I had ever seen her. She spoke of justice, of making Mr. Tremaine understand the consequences of his actions. She said—" Thomas hesitated, evidently wrestling with the implications of what he was about to disclose. "She said that she intended to make him see what he had done, to force him to confront the reality of the suffering he had caused." Whimsy rose from his chair and moved to the window, where he gazed out into the darkness with the air of a man observing something invisible to ordinary perception. "Tell me, Thomas," he said quietly without turning around, "did Miss Eleanor mention any specific plans for accomplishing this confrontation? Did she discuss any particular method or occasion through which she intended to make Mr. Tremaine comprehend his guilt?" "She said she would arrange a meeting," replied Thomas uncomfortably. "At the churchyard, near her aunt's grave. She believed that the location itself would serve as an indictment, that the proximity to the place where her aunt lay would force Mr. Tremaine to acknowledge what he had done." Whimsy turned from the window, and his expression had assumed that quality of profound understanding that generally preceded his most significant revelations. "You have been remarkably forthcoming, Thomas, and I believe you have provided information of considerable significance. However, I must ask you one final question, and I require absolute honesty in your response. Where were you last evening between the hours of 7 and midnight?" Thomas's face had gone quite white. "I was in my room at the house, sir. I did not leave." "But, sir, I swear to you that I have no knowledge of what actually occurred. I did not inform you of this conversation earlier because I could not bear to implicate Miss Eleanor in something that might be construed as premeditation toward violence. If she truly met with Mr. Tremaine that evening, you will remain silent regarding this matter until I determine the precise nature of what occurred," said Whimsy with quiet authority. "Your discretion, ill-advised though it may have been, has at least accomplished the virtue of preventing the destruction of evidence through premature disclosure. Now, I suggest you return to Tremaine House and attempt to maintain the appearance of ordinary routine. I shall contact you if further testimony becomes necessary." After Thomas's departure, Wimsey found himself engaged in that particular species of intellectual activity that characterized his investigations at their most critical junctures: the construction and deconstruction of narrative frameworks, the examination of competing hypotheses, and the patient elimination of possibilities until only the improbable truth remained. He poured himself a fresh glass of port and settled back into the vicar's study chair with the air of a man preparing for an extended engagement with his own thoughts. The evidence, as it currently presented itself, painted a rather damning portrait of Miss Eleanor Hartwell. She possessed both motive in the form of her aunt's tragic history and opportunity, being conveniently unobserved during the relevant hours. She had apparently discussed meeting with Mr. Tremaine at the precise location where he had ultimately been discovered deceased. Thomas's testimony suggested premeditation, or at the very least a deliberate intention to confront her aunt's seducer in circumstances laden with symbolic weight. Yet something in this narrative construction troubled Wimsey profoundly. The pattern was too neat, too perfectly aligned with the assumptions that a superficial investigation would naturally reach. A young woman seeking vengeance for a family tragedy, meeting her victim in a churchyard at night, striking him down with a convenient stone. It was the sort of scenario that popular fiction delighted in presenting, and it was precisely this quality of narrative convenience that awakened Wimsey's skepticism. He rose from his chair and began to pace the study with the methodical rhythm of a man thinking through difficulties of considerable complexity. The murder weapon itself warranted closer examination. The stone had been identified as a decorative ornament, likely from a garden and certainly available within the churchyard itself. Yet the selection of such an implement suggested either desperation or a degree of improvisation inconsistent with careful premeditation. A woman intent upon murder would generally acquire her weapon beforehand. She would not rely upon discovering a suitable instrument at the location of the crime. Furthermore, the force required to deliver the fatal blow suggested a perpetrator possessed of considerable physical strength, something that Miss Eleanor Hartwell, despite her evident determination, did not obviously manifest. Wimsey found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the mysterious gentleman who had visited Tremaine House, to the solicitor from London named Ashford, and to the threatening letters that suggested a conspiracy of considerably greater sophistication than a solitary young woman seeking vengeance could likely orchestrate. He retrieved the letters from his case, spread them upon the desk, and read through them again with the intensity of a scholar attempting to decipher an ancient manuscript. The handwriting in several of the documents bore distinct similarities, suggesting that they had originated from a single correspondent. The tone shifted over time, progressing from angry threats to increasingly formal legal language, as though the writer had enlisted professional assistance in the transformation of personal grievance into financial or legal claim. There was a pattern here, a deliberate escalation of pressure that suggested someone of considerable determination and access to resources. A woman bearing a grudge for 2 decades, perhaps, might orchestrate such a campaign. An entire family, coordinating their efforts toward the destruction of the man who had destroyed one of their own, that would be entirely plausible. Wimsey moved to the vicar's bookshelf and extracted the volume of parish records, returning with it to his desk. He opened to the page containing the burial record for Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell and studied it with renewed attention. The handwriting was that of the then vicar, recorded in 1902, with a notation subsequently added, presumably by the current vicar or his predecessor, marking the grave location as near the laurel shrubbery eastern section. Here, then, was the precise location where Augustus Tremaine had been discovered murdered, not merely in the churchyard, but at the grave of his victim, as though drawing him to that specific location had been essential to the perpetrator's design. A knock at the study door interrupted his reverie. Mrs. Pritchard entered, her demeanor suggesting that she possessed information of sufficient importance to override her natural reluctance to disturb his investigative processes. "Forgive the interruption, sir," she said, "but I felt you ought to know that Inspector Blackthorne has arrived at the vicarage and is demanding an immediate interview with Miss Eleanor Hartwell. He intends to take her into custody, apparently possessing sufficient evidence to warrant her arrest for Mr. Tremaine's murder." Whimsy's expression remained composed, though his eyes acquired that particular glint that suggested the situation had just become considerably more urgent than heretofore. "Has he indeed?" he said quietly. "How remarkably efficient of the inspector. I presume he has based his conclusion upon Miss Eleanor's acknowledged motive and her admitted absence of corroborating witnesses during the relevant hours." "I could not say, sir," replied Mrs. Pritchard carefully, but the inspector appeared quite certain of his position. Whimsy rose from his chair with fluid grace. "I shall require your assistance, Mrs. Pritchard, in a matter of some delicacy. I need you to contact the Mrs. Hartwell's cottage and ensure that Miss Eleanor is informed that I have requested her presence at St. Crispin's churchyard at precisely 10 o'clock this evening. Tell her that I have information regarding her aunt that she will wish to hear, and that she must come alone. Can you accomplish this without drawing Inspector Blackthorne's attention?" Mrs. Pritchard hesitated only briefly before nodding her assent. "I can, sir, though I confess I do not entirely understand the purpose of such an arrangement." "Nor should you," replied Whimsy with a slight smile. "Understanding would only compromise your ability to execute the task with requisite discretion. Go now, and ensure that the message reaches her within the next quarter hour. Time, I fear, has become rather more crucial than I would have preferred." As Mrs. Pritchard departed, Whimsy turned his attention to the remaining documents on the desk. He selected several items of particular significance and placed them carefully within his jacket pocket. Then he withdrew his watch and noted the current time with the precision of a man aware that the forthcoming hours would determine whether a grave injustice was about to be committed or whether the true architecture of a considerably more complex crime was about to be revealed in all its uncomfortable particularity. The churchyard at night possessed a quality distinctly different from its daytime aspect. The grave seemed to acquire dimension and presence in the darkness, and the laurel shrubbery that had seemed merely decorative during the day now appeared vaguely sinister, its branches creating shadows that seemed to move independent of any breeze. Whimsy arrived at the location approximately 30 minutes prior to his appointed meeting with Miss Eleanor, bringing with him nothing but a torch and the accumulated weight of deductions that remained as yet unconfirmed. He positioned himself within sight of the grave, but concealed from the path by which Miss Eleanor would likely approach, and he waited with the patience of a man accustomed to allowing events to unfold according to their own logic, rather than attempting to impose artificial acceleration upon their progression. Miss Eleanor Hartwell arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, moving through the churchyard with the careful steps of someone navigating terrain rendered uncertain by darkness. She was dressed in a dark coat that rendered her nearly invisible against the shadows, and she carried no torch, suggesting a familiarity with the location that transcended casual acquaintance. Whimsy observed her approach from his position of concealment, noting the precise angle of her shoulders, the deliberate nature of her movements, and the absence of any hesitation despite the apparent difficulty of the terrain. She proceeded directly to the grave, and in the faint moonlight that had emerged following the day's relentless rain, Whimsy could discern her kneeling before the headstone, her hand reaching out to trace the inscription with movements that suggested profound familiarity. She remained in this posture for several minutes before Whimsy emerged from the shadows, his torch illuminating the scene with deliberate gradualism rather than sudden revelation. Miss Eleanor rose to her feet with remarkable composure, betraying neither alarm nor surprise at his appearance. "You have had me followed," she said flatly, as though confirming something she had long suspected. "Or you have deduced my intentions through that peculiar reasoning process that appears to function in your mind like a chess engine operating at inhuman velocity." "Neither, actually," replied Whimsy, keeping his torch directed downward so as to illuminate only the grave between them. "I have merely arranged for you to confirm certain conclusions that I had already reached through more conventional analytical methods. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, how long have you known?" "Known what, precisely?" she asked, her voice acquiring a sharp edge that suggested genuine confusion rather than evasion. "Known that Augustus Tremaine murdered your aunt. Known that he seduced her, abandoned her, and left her to die in circumstances of profound destitution and shame. I have known these facts for approximately 3 weeks, since my grandmother's deathbed confession. What I did not know until recently was that Mr. Tremaine had deliberately come to this village, to this churchyard, apparently for purposes of acknowledging his guilt, or perhaps of expiating it through proximity to the grave he had created." Whimsy lowered his torch further, allowing the darkness to reclaim the upper portion of the scene. "What I particularly did not know," he continued quietly, "was whether you had murdered him. The evidence seemed to suggest your guilt quite forcefully. You possessed motive, opportunity, and you had apparently arranged a meeting with him at this very location. Inspector Blackthorne has been sufficiently persuaded by these circumstances to warrant your immediate arrest. However, I have become increasingly convinced that you did not, in fact, commit this murder, which presents a rather significant problem, as your arrest would represent a profound miscarriage of justice and would allow the true perpetrator to escape with considerable confidence that the investigation has reached its natural conclusion." Eleanor's expression had shifted from guarded defensiveness to something approaching despair. "I did meet with him that evening," she admitted. "I came to this grave specifically to force him to acknowledge what he had done, to confront the reality of his crime. But when I arrived, he was already here, kneeling before the headstone exactly as I have just been kneeling. He was weeping, sir, weeping with a degree of genuine anguish that I had not anticipated. He was speaking to the grave, speaking to my aunt, begging her forgiveness, and claiming that he had come to Ashford specifically to place flowers upon her grave, and to arrange that her burial site be properly maintained in perpetuity. He was genuinely grief-stricken, genuinely remorseful." "And what did you do when confronted with this unexpected display of contrition?" asked Whimsy. "I did what any daughter of a victim would do. I made myself known. I revealed my identity and the nature of my connection to him. I told him that belated remorse could not undo the decades of suffering that his actions had inflicted upon my family. I demanded that he acknowledge his responsibility, that he provide compensation for the destitution and shame he had caused." Eleanor paused, and her hands had begun to tremble in the darkness. "He agreed, sir. He agreed entirely. He said he had been expecting such a confrontation, that he had in fact hoped to encounter me or someone from my family, that he had spent years attempting to locate any surviving relatives so that he might attempt some form of restitution. He offered me money, a considerable sum, and he offered to endow my position at the school permanently, ensuring my financial security. And then," she stopped, her voice breaking slightly, "and then I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the path. Mr. Tremaine appeared suddenly alarmed. He told me to conceal myself within the shrubbery, saying that he was expecting another visitor and that the meeting was of considerable delicacy. I did as he instructed, remaining hidden within the laurels while he waited at the grave." "And you observed what occurred subsequently?" prompted Whimsy, his voice taking on a quality of intense focus. "I observed a man arrive," said Eleanor. "A man of perhaps 40 years of age, dressed in formal evening attire despite the inclement weather. I could not see his face clearly from my position within the shrubbery, but I heard their conversation distinctly. The man accused Mr. Tremaine of having betrayed him, of having broken a promise made years ago. He said something about Mr. Tremaine having failed to honor an obligation that had been negotiated through considerable difficulty. Mr. Tremaine appeared extremely agitated. He said that he had paid substantially, and that further demands were unconscionable. The man replied that Mr. Tremaine had paid for one crime, but that there were others, and that the bill had not yet been satisfactorily settled." Whimsy's expression had grown remarkably sharp. Did the man mention what these additional crimes comprised? "He did not speak with precision," replied Eleanor, "but he referred to a young woman named Margaret, and he said something about a child that had been born and subsequently abandoned. Mr. Tremaine denied any involvement in the matter. He said it was a confusion of circumstances, that he had never— But then the man struck him, sir. He struck him quite viciously across the face, and Mr. Tremaine fell. The man seized the stone ornament from where it lay in the grass and began to strike Mr. Tremaine repeatedly. I should have screamed, I should have emerged from the shrubbery, but I was paralyzed with shock. By the time I gathered sufficient courage to act, it was finished. The man had fled into the darkness, and Mr. Tremaine was lying motionless upon the grave. Eleanor's entire frame was shaking now, and she sank to her knees before the headstone. I emerged from the shrubbery, and I attempted to ascertain whether he still possessed any sign of life, but it was abundantly clear that he did not. And then I fled as well, returning to the cottage in a state of considerable distress. I said nothing to anyone because I believed that any revelation of my presence would implicate me in the crime, would suggest that I had murdered him as retribution for my aunt's death. I allowed myself to be suspected rather than speak. Whimsy's torch had fallen to his side, its beam now illuminating nothing but the ground beneath his feet. "Did you observe any identifying features of this man?" he asked quietly. "Anything distinctive? An accent, a scar, a peculiarity of speech or movement?" "Only one thing," replied Eleanor. "His left hand bore a distinctive scar, running from the wrist to the base of the middle finger. It was quite pronounced, quite impossible to conceal." Whimsy's entire posture underwent a subtle transformation, suggesting that Eleanor's description had precipitated a cascade of realizations that altered the entire architecture of his investigative framework. He raised his torch, directing its beam toward Eleanor's face in order to observe her expression with greater precision, then lowered it again with deliberate care. "You have described a man possessed of considerable anger and a willingness to employ violence in service of what he apparently considered to be justice," he said thoughtfully. "A man capable of pursuing a vendetta across years, or perhaps decades. A man who had negotiated with Augustus Tremaine regarding compensation for wrongs committed, and who believed those negotiations to have been insufficient in scope or magnitude. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, did this man make any reference to his own identity? Did Mr. Tremaine address him by name?" "He did," confirmed Eleanor. Mr. Tremaine said, "Edward, this is unconscionable. I have honored our arrangement precisely as negotiated. To demand more is to demand the impossible." The man, Edward, replied that Mr. Tremaine's understanding of honor was precisely the problem, that he had never comprehended the true cost of his actions. Whimsy closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, his expression had acquired that quality of terrible certainty that generally accompanied the final alignment of disparate elements into coherent pattern. "Edward Ashford," he murmured, "the solicitor from London who visited Tremaine House on multiple occasions, a man possessed of legal training, of access to resources, and apparently of a personal connection to Augustus Tremaine that transcended mere professional association. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, did the name Ashford mean anything to your family? Did your grandmother ever mention an individual bearing that surname?" Eleanor's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. "There was a man," she said slowly, "whom my grandmother mentioned in her deathbed confession. She said that my Aunt Catherine had been involved with not one man but two, that she had borne a child to Augustus Tremaine, but that she had subsequently become involved with another gentleman named Edward Ashford, who had wished to marry her despite her damaged reputation. That Edward had offered to legitimize the child, to provide for both mother and offspring, but that my aunt had refused, believing herself unworthy of such kindness. She had taken her own life rather than allow him to sacrifice himself for her sake. The revelation hung in the darkness between them, with the weight of accumulated tragedy spanning more than 2 decades. "Good God," said Whimsy quietly. "So we have here not merely a vendetta of financial restitution, but a crime of passion rooted in thwarted love and accumulated loss. Edward Ashford loved Catherine Hartwell, was willing to accept her child as his own, was prepared to marry her and restore her to respectability, and when she rejected his offer and took her own life, he was left with decades of grief and the knowledge that Augustus Tremaine bore responsibility for the circumstances that had driven her to suicide. Tremaine received the blackmail letters, Tremaine received the threatening visits, Tremaine paid money to Ashford in attempts to purchase absolution. Yet no amount of financial recompense could adequately address the reality that Catherine Hartwell was dead, that she had died believing herself irredeemable, that her child had grown up without a father or a mother's love. He began to pace the perimeter of the grave with measured steps. The question becomes whether Tremaine's murder represented a calculated execution, or whether it constituted a crime of passion, whether Ashford deliberately orchestrated the murder in this specific location as a form of poetic justice, or whether his presence here was coincidental, his eruption into violence spontaneous rather than premeditated. "There was a letter," said Eleanor quietly, "a letter that arrived at Mr. Tremaine's house several weeks ago, the one that caused him such evident distress. I saw it inadvertently, and I attempted to read it without Mr. Tremaine's knowledge. It was from Edward Ashford, and it contained a statement that has remained with me since I encountered it. The letter read, 'I shall come to Ashford Village on the 23rd of this month, and I shall expect to meet with you at the grave of the woman whose death you caused. If you do not appear at that location, or if you attempt to evade this meeting, I shall ensure that the full particulars of your crime are disclosed to the authorities and to the public. Your time of reckoning has arrived.'" Wimsey ceased his pacing. "The 23rd, he said quietly, "the date upon which Mr. Tremaine was murdered. A carefully orchestrated appointment with violent retribution. A crime premeditated with deliberate precision, designed not merely to kill Augustus Tremaine, but to kill him at the location that symbolized his deepest guilt. Edward Ashford did not stumble upon Tremaine at the grave, Miss Hartwell. He lured him there with a letter that was simultaneously a threat and a promise. He planned this murder with the methodical precision of a man who had spent years calculating the form his vengeance would assume." Eleanor had begun to weep quietly, her entire frame shaking with the accumulated weight of shock and moral complexity. "But he did not murder in cold blood," she protested. "He murdered a man who had destroyed his life, who had destroyed the life of the woman he loved. There is a distinction, surely there is a moral distinction between justice and murder." "There is indeed a distinction," agreed Wimsey, his voice acquiring a quality of profound melancholy. "However, the distinction exists primarily in the perception of those who observe the act, not in the nature of the act itself. Edward Ashford has committed murder. Whether that murder constitutes an act of justice, of vengeance, or of unforgivable violence depends entirely upon one's perspective regarding the sufficiency of his prior suffering. The law, regrettably, does not permit such philosophical distinctions. The law requires that we accept murder as murder, regardless of the righteousness of the murderer's grievance." He extended his hand to Eleanor, assisting her to her feet with courteous precision. "You must return to the cottage now, Miss Hartwell. You must prepare yourself for the likelihood that you shall be taken into custody by Inspector Blackthorne, at least temporarily. However, I possess sufficient information to establish your innocence conclusively, and I shall ensure that the true nature of this crime is made manifest to the authorities. In the interim, you must maintain absolute discretion regarding this conversation and regarding what you have witnessed this evening. Can you accomplish this?" Eleanor nodded, though her expression suggested profound uncertainty. "I can, though I confess I do not understand how you intend to locate Mr. Ashford or convince the authorities of his guilt when he has already fled the village." "As to his location," replied Wimsey, retrieving several documents from his jacket pocket and examining them briefly in the torchlight, "I possess a rather clear understanding of where Mr. Ashford will be. As to convincing the authorities, I shall endeavor to create circumstances sufficiently dramatic to render denial impossible. Now go. And Miss Hartwell, do not attempt to warn Mr. Ashford or to communicate with him in any manner. What occurs next must be allowed to unfold without interference from those possessed of emotional investment in the outcome." By the time Wimsey returned to the vicarage, the hour had advanced to nearly 11:30, and the establishment had assumed that peculiar quality of stillness that characterizes households in the aftermath of scandal and uncertainty. Inspector Blackthorne had taken himself off to the village inn, apparently convinced that Miss Eleanor Hartwell would maintain her residence at the cottage pending his morning arrest, and the Reverend Blackwood had retired to his chambers with the demeanor of a man whose faith in both divine provy, dense and human virtue had been subjected to considerable strain. Wimsey, however, found himself possessed of an energy that transcended the ordinary fatigue that should have accompanied the lateness of the hour. He proceeded directly to the vicar's study and began to compose a telegram with the methodical precision of a man whose thoughts had crystallized into absolute certainty regarding the course of action that circumstances now demanded. The telegram was addressed to a contact within the London Metropolitan Police, whom Wimsey knew to be possessed of considerable resources and a willingness to accommodate aristocratic requests that fell within the bounds of legal propriety. Its content was brief. Edward Ashford, solicitor, believed to have departed Ashford Village following murder of Augustus Tremaine, likely attempting to reach London by rail. Scarring on left hand may assist identification. Urgent that he be located before dawn departure. Will provide full particulars upon receipt of confirmation of location. He dispatched the telegram through the vicar's housekeeper, who had proven remarkably accommodating regarding the various nocturnal activities that the investigation had necessitated, and then settled himself to await developments with the patience of a man accustomed to allowing his deductions to be validated by the inexorable progression of events. Sleep proved impossible, and Wimsey occupied the intervening hours by subjecting the accumulated evidence to one final comprehensive examination. He arranged the letters, the parish records, and the various testimonies in precise chronological order, constructing a narrative arc that began with Catherine Hartwell's seduction and abandonment approximately 24 years prior and extended through to Augustus Tremaine's murder in the churchyard. The pattern, once fully articulated, possessed an almost tragic inevitability, a sequence of interconnected actions and reactions, each flowing logically from what preceded it, each rendering the ultimate outcome progressively more certain. Catherine Hartwell had been seduced by a man to whom morality represented merely an obstacle to personal gratification. She had borne his child and been abandoned in circumstances of profound destitution. Edward Ashford had loved her, had offered her salvation through marriage and respectability, and had been rejected by a woman who believed herself irredeemable. She had taken her own life, leaving Edward with decades of accumulated grief and Edward's nephew, for such Wimsey now suspected the younger Hartwell child to be, with the knowledge that his mother had died because of Tremaine's cruelty. Augustus Tremaine, apparently possessed of a conscience that had grown increasingly burdensome with advancing age, had attempted to purchase absolution through financial restitution. Edward Ashford had accepted the money while simultaneously planning the murder that would serve as final reckoning for crimes that mere money could not adequately address. It was a narrative of such profound psychological complexity that Wimsey found himself experiencing something approaching sympathy for the perpetrator, despite the indefensible nature of his actions. At 4:30 in the morning, the telegram arrived. Edward Ashford had been identified at King's Cross Station, attempting to board a train bound for Edinburgh. He possessed the scarring that Eleanor Hartwell had described, and he had been taken into custody pending formal charges. A more detailed communication would follow once the London police had conducted their preliminary interrogation. Wimsey set down the telegram and permitted himself a sip of the port that had remained untouched throughout the night. The investigation was, in its essential particle, ours, concluded. What remained was merely the theatrical presentation of conclusions that he had already reached through logical deduction. He rose from the vicar's study at 6 o'clock and proceeded to Tremaine House, where he presented himself to a Mrs. Pritchard, whose expressions of surprise suggested that she had not anticipated his arrival at such an unseemly hour. "I require," announced Wimsey without preamble, "that you summon Inspector Blackthorne to Tremaine House at 8 o'clock precisely. Tell him that I have identified the perpetrator of Augustus Tremaine's murder, and that I shall provide a comprehensive explanation of the crime's motivation and mechanics at that time. Furthermore, inform him that he should arrange for Miss Eleanor Hartwell to be brought to this location, rather than taken into custody, as she shall be required to provide corroborating testimony regarding certain particulars of my investigation." Mrs. Pritchard appeared considerably bewildered by these pronouncements, but she departed to execute her instructions with the efficiency that had characterized her service throughout the investigation. Wimsey occupied the intervening hours by conducting a meticulous examination of Tremaine's study, paying particular attention to a safe that he discovered concealed behind a portrait of dubious artistic merit. Through the application of considerable patience and a manipulation technique that suggested prior experience with such devices, he managed to gain access to its contents. Inside, he discovered precisely what he had anticipated: correspondence between Augustus Tremaine and Edward Ashford spanning a period of 15 years, documenting the evolution of blackmail into negotiation and ultimately into a form of tortured reconciliation that had proven fundamentally unstable. There were also documents pertaining to the endowment of Eleanor Hartwell's position at the school, annotated with marginal notes in Tremaine's handwriting that suggested he had recognized the young woman's connection to Catherine Hartwell and had seen in her employment an opportunity for a form of vicarious redemption that might somehow mitigate his original crime. Inspector Blackthorne arrived at 8 o'clock precisely, accompanied by several constables and possessed of an expression suggesting considerable irritation at being summoned to Tremaine House at such an hour by an aristocratic amateur. "Lord Peter," he said with barely suppressed resentment, "I trust you possess information sufficiently compelling to justify this early morning disruption of my investigation. I was on the verge of formally arresting Miss Eleanor Hartwell, and I should prefer not to have wasted the preparatory efforts that such an arrest would have required." "The arrest of Miss Hartwell would have constituted a grave miscarriage of justice," replied Whimsy mildly, "and I trust that you will find the information I am about to present to be sufficiently compelling to convince you of her innocence and to redirect your investigative efforts toward the true perpetrator, who has already been apprehended in London and is currently in custody pending formal charges." He proceeded to lay out the accumulated evidence with the precision of a man accustomed to presenting complex information to audiences possessed of limited patience for ambiguity. The parish records, the correspondence between Tremaine and Ashford, the testimony provided by Eleanor Hartwell regarding the events of the murder night, all were presented in sequence, building toward a conclusion that appeared inevitable in retrospect, though it had required considerable deductive labor to initially perceive. Inspector Blackthorne's expression evolved from skepticism through grudging acceptance to something uproar, ching admiration, as the narrative unfolded. By the time Whimsy concluded his presentation, the inspector possessed a comprehensive understanding of the crime's true nature and the identity of its perpetrator. The confrontation between Whimsy and Edward Ashford occurred not in a police interrogation room but in the study of Tremaine House, a deliberate choice that Whimsy had made after considerable reflection regarding the psychological efficacy of various environments. Ashford had been transported from London under police guard, and he arrived at the house with the demeanor of a man who had come to terms with the inevitable consequences of actions undertaken with full consciousness of their ultimate trajectory. He was indeed approximately 40 years of age, possessed of the intellectual bearing one would anticipate from a solicitor of considerable experience, and his left hand bore the distinctive scarring that Eleanor Hartwell had described, a scar that suggested either a significant injury or a wound deliberately inflicted with considerable force. "Mr. Ashford," said Whimsy, extending his hand with courteous precision despite the circumstances that rendered such civility technically inappropriate, "I have spent the past 36 hours attempting to understand the precise mechanisms of your psychology, the particular constellation of grief and rage and twisted sense of justice that motivated you to murder Augustus Tremaine in a churchyard on a Tuesday evening. I confess that I find myself possessed of considerable sympathy for your suffering, though sympathy and condemnation constitute distinctly separate phenomena." Ashford accepted the handshake with apparent indifference to its social implications. "You have constructed a narrative," he said quietly, "in which I appear as a man driven by vengeance and unresolved grief. I suspect the narrative possesses able accuracy in its broad particulars, though the specifics of motivation are likely to exceed your understanding, possessed as you are of the privilege of a man who has never experienced the particular form of destitution that results from love rejected by circumstances of social condemnation." "You are correct," acknowledged Whimsy. "I have experienced rejection, but never rejection rooted in the belief that one was fundamentally unworthy of love. Catherine Hartwell believed herself irredeemable because she had borne a child outside wedlock, because society had deemed her fallen and therefore permanently damned. Your offer of marriage, your willingness to accept her and her child, constituted a form of grace that she was psychologically incapable of accepting. And when she chose death, rather than your salvation, you were left with the knowledge that the man responsible for her damnation had escaped with relative impunity, protected by wealth and social position. Ashford's hands had begun to tremble, and he sank into a chair with the air of a man whose emotional resources had been entirely expended. "He paid me money," he said bitterly. "Year after year, he paid me money as though money could somehow constitute adequate compensation for a human life lost to despair and social condemnation. I accepted the payments because I had exhausted every legal avenue through which I might have prosecuted him for seduction and abandonment. The laws of this nation protect men of wealth and status with remarkable thoroughness. My only recourse was blackmail, and my only hope was that sufficient financial pressure might at least force him to acknowledge the gravity of what he had done." "And did he acknowledge it?" asked Wimsey. "Did his presence at Catherine's grave on the evening of his death suggest that he had finally achieved comprehension of the consequences his actions had?" "Inflicted?" Ashford's expression crumbled entirely, and he buried his face in his hands with a gesture of such profound despair that even Inspector Blackthorne appeared visibly moved by the display. "He wept," said Ashford through his fingers. "He knelt before her grave, and he wept with genuine anguish. He said he had spent decades attempting to locate surviving relatives, that he had come to this village specifically to place flowers upon her grave and to arrange for its perpetual maintenance. He said he had been searching for an opportunity to acknowledge his crime and to provide whatever compensation remained possible. And in that moment when I heard his words and observed his genuine remorse, I experienced a fury so profound that I could not contain it. All the years of grief, all the years of rage held carefully in check, all the years of believing that justice would never be served, they erupted in a single moment of absolute violence." He looked up at Wimsey with eyes that conveyed the full extent of his psychological torment. "I struck him with a stone," he continued. "I struck him repeatedly until he ceased to move, until the physical destruction of his body seemed to match the destruction his actions had inflicted upon Catherine. And then I stood over his corpse, and I realized that I had murdered the only man who had ever genuinely attempted to acknowledge his crime and offer restitution. I had destroyed the one opportunity I possessed to achieve any form of reconciliation with the past." The room had fallen into profound silence. Inspector Blackthorne appeared uncertain whether to proceed with formal charges or to permit the conversation to continue. Wimsey, however, rose from his chair and moved to the window, where he gazed out upon the rain-soaked gardens with an expression of contemplative melancholy. "The tragedy," he said quietly, "is your rage, justified though it might have been, was ultimately directed at the wrong target. Augustus Tremaine was guilty, certainly, but he was not the fundamental architect of Catherine Hartwell's destruction. Society was. The rigid moral codes that rendered a woman irredeemable for a single indiscretion, the economic structures that rendered her vulnerable to seduction by men of superior social status, the legal systems that provided no recourse for women victimized by abandonment, these were the true perpetrators of Catherine's death. Tremaine was merely an instrument through which these larger forces operated. And yet," said Ashford, "he is dead, and I shall be executed for his murder, and Catherine remains dead despite all the years of rage and all the legal maneuvering and all the philosophical analysis we might engage in regarding the structural injustices that facilitated her destruction. Nothing changes. The world continues precisely as it was. The world does indeed continue," agreed Wimsey, "though the particulars of individual fates are substantially altered by the choices we make. Eleanor Hartwell shall be exonerated of suspicion and shall inherit a considerable endowment that will ensure her financial security and allow her to continue her work as a music instructor. The Mrs. Hartwell shall be provided with resources sufficient to render their final years considerably more comfortable than they have heretofore been. And you, Mr. Ashford, shall face the consequences of your actions with the knowledge that your crime, however understandable its motivations, has not accomplished the justice you believed it would achieve." Inspector Blackthorne moved forward to take Ashford into formal custody, and as he was led from the study, Whimsy remained at the window, observing the gardens beyond with the air of a man contemplating the fundamental inadequacy of even the most brilliant deductive reasoning when confronted with the irreducible complexity of human suffering. The case, from a technical perspective, was concluded. The guilty party had been identified, apprehended, and would face the full weight of legal consequences. Yet Whimsy found himself possessed of a profound dissatisfaction with the outcome, a recognition that the resolution of the mystery had accomplished nothing meaningful regarding the underlying tragedy that had motivated the crime. Justice, he reflected, was often merely the substitution of one form of suffering for another, a mechanical process that mimicked moral satisfaction while accomplishing nothing of genuine value. He composed a letter to Eleanor Hartwell, informing her that her name had been entirely cleared and that she should expect a substantial bequest to be transferred to her account within the fortnight. He provided the Mrs. Hartwell with anonymously sourced funds designated for their comfort and security, and then he packed his belongings and departed Ashford Village as quietly and deliberately as he had arrived, leaving behind only the faint impression that a man of considerable intellect had passed through, observed the mechanics of human tragedy with detached precision, and moved on to whatever mysteries next demanded his attention. The Reverend Blackwood, standing at the vicarage gate to bid him farewell, attempted to express gratitude for the resolution of the case, but Whimsy merely smiled, with the wry expression of a man who understood that gratitude was fundamentally misplaced. "The mystery has been solved," he said, "and the criminal has been apprehended. Whether this constitutes a satisfactory conclusion, or merely the substitution of legal consequences for private revenge, remains, I suspect, a matter of considerable philosophical debate that shall occupy considerably more intelligent minds than my own for years to come. Farewell, Reverend. I trust the parish shall recover from this unseemly disruption of its customary tranquility."